In the second year of my arranged marriage with my childhood sweetheart, his first love came back. However, I had an accident and lost my memory due to a car crash. When I woke up again, he was no longer as cold as before. He tenderly kissed the tips of my fingers. You don't need to remember. Just know that our married life is harmonious. But that night, when I was standing at the door of his bedroom with a pillow in my arms, he stared at me with an ambiguous look and said in a hoarse voice, "Are you sure you want to come in?" Later, I remembered everything. Feeling melancholy, I was packing my bags and planning to leave when he came back drunk. He calmly locked the door of the room and walked towards me with a faint smile. "What, planning to go to your senior? Do you really think I don't exist? What do you remember?" Cashin asked. I was lying on the hospital bed and shook my head. "I don't remember anything." He looked at me deeply for a long time before taking my ID photo and other things to tell me about my background bit by bit. Finally, he lifted my hand and slowly and tenderly kissed the tips of my fingers. "Don't be afraid if you can't remember. You just need to know that our married life is harmonious." I wasn't sure if he meant something else, but my face still blushed involuntarily. Feeling a bit embarrassed, I asked in a low voice for confirmation. "Are we in love?" The last kiss landed on my wrist. Cashin's eyes looking at me were as dark as unfathomable ink. Of course. Perhaps his gaze was too sincere, or perhaps the way he kissed was particularly familiar. Without too many doubts, I chose to believe him. I was a bit clingy to Cashin. "That's what the doctor said. Probably because you were the first person she saw after losing her memory, so she developed an attachment." Cashin followed the doctor's advice and took me downstairs for a walk. The cold wind blew towards me, and I couldn't help shivering. "Cold?" He let go of my hand and was about to put his coat on me. I thought Cashin had really low emotional intelligence. I raised my hand to stop his hand. The next second, I wrapped my arms around his waist and snuggled into his arms. "Like this, neither of us will be cold." I looked up from his arms and taught him seriously. Then I couldn't help but question and complained with a bit of grievance. "Cashin, do you really love me? Why don't you hug me much?" Cashin's eyes suddenly darkened. By the time I sensed the danger, it was a bit late. Cashin directly carried me to a deserted corner. He held my chin and his kiss fell. "I love you." 1 second before my breath was taken away, I heard him murmur in a low voice. His cold voice, under the influence of the charming atmosphere, actually made me hear some suppressed love. "How dare you say I don't love you?" I clung to Cashin's shoulders and dazedly accepted his kiss. Midway, he paused briefly. His kisses were densely printed on my cheek. "Will you be uncomfortable?" I pursed my lips. My face was burning hot like a cooked shrimp. "I don't seem to be very good at kissing." I suppressed my shyness and asked Teacher Cashin for advice. Did I forget, or was it like this before? Cashin still wrapped his coat around me. He was only wearing a thin shirt. His hand rubbed my red-hot earlobes. He didn't answer. When he spoke again, his voice seemed to carry a bit of hoarse allure. "Do you want to try again, Lyra? This time, you take the initiative." Cashin asked me to take the initiative and kiss him like he did. I hoped that someone would pass by at this moment to rescue me from this bewildering situation. But this place was too remote, and there was no one at all. After a month of getting along, I saw all the kindness Cashin showed me. He was a meticulous husband. I should also be nicer to him. "Then lower your head a bit. I can't reach you." The last few words were as soft as a mosquito's buzzing. Cashin smiled faintly and lowered his head to cooperate with me. I slowly leaned over, learning from his way, and kissed him clumsily. The man's grip on me tightened a bit more. A few days before I was discharged from the hospital, a strange boy came to see me. At that time, Cashin had just gone out to buy porridge. He said he was my senior from my second year of graduate school, Orion. He sighed and joked, "If you don't remember the experiment we were halfway through, I'll be very sad." I took his experimental notes, but the process on it didn't seem unfamiliar to me. I seemed to be quite familiar with it. I should be able to get back to it in a few days. Orion then let out a sigh of relief and raised his hand with a smile. It was a gesture to touch my head. What are you doing? I just frowned and avoided Orion's outstretched hand, looking behind him. Cashin was standing by the door with a faint smile. His tone was gentle, but his eyes were full of gloom. This is my husband. Orion shrugged indifferently. So what? Cashin didn't even give me time to be shocked that he directly pressed his head with one hand and pushed him against the sink in the ward. Cashin seemed to be a very gentle person. I didn't expect him to have such a violent moment. What's going on? Cashin asked with a smile. Should I help you sober up? Wait until you understand what husband means before you open your mouth. The next second, he turned on the faucet. He let the ice-cold water pour on Orion's head. I was finally brought back to my senses by Orion's shouts. I ran out of bed without even putting on my shoes and went to pull Cashin's hand. Okay, don't be angry anymore. You quickly let him go. Cashin remained unmoved and his eyes were still indifferent without a trace of emotion. I looked at Orion, who was almost suffocating. In a hurry, I went to pull Cashin's arm. Husband. Cashin paused. Finally, he loosened his grip a bit and stared at me with an ambiguous look. Orion regained his strength and raised his fist again like a Monday morning quarterback. You fucking asshole. I stood in front of Cashin expressionless. Senior, it was you who had no sense of boundaries first. There's nothing to complain about being beaten. Don't keep pestering. Orion paused and stared at me meaningfully. Lyra, you should also listen to others about your past memories. His gaze shifted to Cashin. Can you really believe one side of the story? After saying that, he slouched and left, slamming the door. Why did you get out of bed without wearing shoes? Cashin had completely suppressed the hostility around him. He directly carried me back. I was distracted and temporarily forgot Orion's words. I wrapped my arms around his neck and didn't let go in a hurry. Our eyes met and I smiled with my eyes curved. Husband. The man immediately paused. Do you like it very much when I call you that? Cashin didn't answer and directly kissed me. He didn't give me time to recover and directly pried open my teeth. When Cashin let me go again, I was already a bit dizzy due to lack of oxygen. He bit my lower lip lightly and said in a deep voice. Say it again. I could feel his palms starting to get hot. So I obediently retreated to a safe distance and didn't provoke him anymore. Looking at him, I blinked. My voice was muffled. Cashin. During my hospitalization, while gradually getting to know myself, I also discovered a problem. Cashin and I hadn't had time to take wedding photos. One day after I was discharged from the hospital, I finally had some free time. I went to the company to find Cashin to discuss a date. Mr. Song, I'm so tired this morning. I can't work at all anymore. Can I just skip work this afternoon? I stood stiffly at the door, watching a girl chirping around Cashin like a lark. And Cashin was sitting in the boss's chair, neither agreeing nor refusing her approach. Suddenly, I felt that I seemed to have overlooked many details. At this moment, the girl looked up and accidentally glanced at me. She stood up arrogantly and walked past me directly to leave. The moment Cashin looked up at me, the indifference in his eyes instantly turned into tenderness. He walked closer and wrapped both of my hands with his. Why are they so cold? With that, he lifted my hand and touched it to his lips. He urged softly. I didn't move. Looking at him for a while, I slowly said, Cashin. I want to hear the truth. I paused for a few seconds, preparing myself fully for all possible consequences. Before I lost my memory, did you really like me? Please don't lie to me. Cashin's eyes trembled, and suddenly he tightened his grip on my hand. I was hurt by the grip and couldn't help frowning and hissing softly. Cashin seemed to immediately come to his senses and loosened his grip. Instead, he held me tightly in his arms. Lyra, don't doubt my feelings for you. He kissed my hair densely, and then downward. His kisses landed on my eyelids, the tip of my nose, and then on my lips. I love you. Our eyes met, and his eyes showed a precarious sense of reason. I love you, Lyra. He repeated in a trembling voice, the sadness in his eyes almost burned me. I listlessly hugged him back. Sorry, Cashin. Cashin explained to me that the girl was his cousin. She had never gotten along with me before. No wonder she gave me a dirty look just now. At this moment, the office door was suddenly knocked on. Mr. Song, I really won't come this afternoon anymore. It was the voice of his little cousin. Get lost. You don't need to come anymore. Cashin replied expressionlessly. Immediately after, I felt the door being kicked. Someone shouted outside, "You're so awesome." I was still in shock that the girl dared to curse Cashin when he kissed me, taking away my breath. Cashin pulled my hands to wrap around his neck and called me softly over and over again. Lyra. Lyra. I was distracted by the inadvertent humility shown by Cashin. So, when it was completely dark outside, I held a pillow and knocked on Cashin's door. The man was leaning on the door frame with his hand. I thought for a few seconds and chose what I thought was the most tactful way to say it. I feel a bit scared being alone. I looked up, looking at the man with burning eyes. His sleeve just hung down. Cashin's eyes seemed to hold a storm. His voice was hoarse. Are you sure you want to come in? Since coming home from the hospital, Cashin had been sleeping in a separate room on the grounds that my body hadn't fully recovered. But I knew I was already fine. Cashin. I slowly took a step towards him but didn't go in. Do you want me to come in? Cashin's response was to directly carry me into the house and then wrap me up in the quilt like a silkworm cocoon. Me. Cashin embraced me from behind. I pulled aside a corner of the quilt and looked back, asking carefully, Cashin. Did you let me stay in a separate room because there's something wrong with you? I thought that between husband and wife, we should be more honest with each other. The moonlight intertwined with the darkness and fell into Cashin's eyes, hiding all his emotions. Where? His voice was flat and calm. I stared at him without saying a word. How could he not know what I was referring to? Cashin furrowed his brow slightly, as if he was really thinking about it. My leg? He said hesitantly. I stared at him for a few more seconds and then suddenly made a bold decision. I stretched my hand out of the quilt. Slowly approaching. I'll know after I check it myself. My voice grew softer, but my courage grew bigger. A second before I touched it, my wrist was grasped. Cashin kneaded my hand gently but firmly in the dark. What does Lyra want to check? Tell me, and I'll let you touch. What a pervert. I quickly withdrew my hand and rolled myself into the quilt. I don't want to check anything. I suspected that Cashin had a penchant for dirty talk. Cashin was really hard to understand. He seemed to be at two extremes. He was a gentleman who restrained himself and followed propriety, but sometimes he would also show a greedy desire. On the day of trying on the wedding dress, I arrived earlier than Cashin. I happened to meet Orion, who was working part-time here. He said a lot of irrelevant things, but only one sentence left a deep impression on me. The way you defended your husband that day was rather unusual. I don't know much, but I also heard you say during a game of truth or dare that you and your husband each had someone you liked. I stood alone in the fitting room, lost in thought as I repeatedly thought about this sentence. Why don't you come out after changing? Cashin quietly entered the fitting room and stood behind me. I came to my senses and met Cashin's gaze in the mirror. I just met Orion. The one from last time who was a student. I know. Cashin interrupted me casually. I was stunned for a moment. Then I was embraced by one hand and pressed into his arms. The man lowered his eyes and leaned close to the back of my ear. On you. The warm breath made me tremble involuntarily. There's the smell of men's perfume. After saying that, I bit him gently. Cashin. I raised my hand to push him away and my complaint stopped his movement. He said that I once said myself that you and I each had someone we liked. I came to my senses and looked up at him. Cashin probably didn't expect me to be so direct and was stunned for a second. He pursed his lips tightly and waited quietly for my reaction. Under his calm eyes, I still saw a glint of uneasiness in them. I don't think what he said must be wrong. We can also understand it as the people we each like are each other, right? I deliberately took my time to explain and looked at Cashin teasingly. But unexpectedly, he didn't relax after hearing this. His eyes were still deep and unfathomable. Cashin? I called him softly tentatively. After a long while, he lowered his eyes and finally spoke. No, Lyra. I froze, and my smile froze on my face. You've never liked me. I lied to you. I'm sorry. Now, I don't want to continue this deception anymore. From beginning to end, Cashin didn't raise his eyes, hiding all his emotions. I didn't react immediately and just stared at him in astonishment. He didn't wait for my answer. After 2 seconds of silence, he spoke again. I'll ask the driver to take you back. A hint of trembling still leaked from his voice. I watched his departing figure and chased after him without thinking. Cashin. Outside the bridal shop, I caught up with Cashin, who was about to open the car door. He stopped and turned around. Have you ever done anything to let me down or treated me badly before? He stared at me closely. Although he didn't understand my out-of-the-blue question, he still answered without hesitation. No. Then after we got married, were you only in love with me? I was still wearing the unpaid wedding dress and was stubbornly holding his arm. Cashin's voice was hoarse. I liked you even before we got married. He added in a low voice. All along, I've only liked you. The emotion in Cashin when he confessed earlier was as stable as a deserted ruin, deathly still. I pushed aside the debris and only then saw the lingering struggle beneath it. Cashin. I tried to make my voice as gentle as possible. Then can you promise not to lie to me anymore in the future? Suddenly and inappropriately, I thought that I seemed to be coaxing a child. Cashin probably understood what I meant. He stared fixedly at me. Okay. His voice melted into the wind and blew past my ears. I curved my lips and pulled him towards the bridal shop. I like you now too, so I forgive you for this little mistake. Also, next time, can you wait for me to finish speaking before you leave? Don't just think wildly by yourself and then hide in your own shell. So sentimental. I thought that after our frank conversation, Cashin would change. But he still held on to his defenses tightly. At night, he wrapped me tightly in another quilt like a silkworm cocoon that couldn't break free. Cashin, I'm serious. I took a deep breath and forcibly suppressed my anger. If you really have any problems, don't avoid seeing a doctor. Cashin started to be shameless. He just gave a faint I have problems and can't do it. Me. He insisted that he wouldn't touch me until I remembered something. Essentially, it was his deep-rooted inferiority that made him not believe that I would still like him after recovering my memory. The progress of winning over Cashin came to a standstill. The appearance of Astria, which I thought would be a stumbling block, turned out to be a catalyst instead. Inside Cashin's office, I was curled up on the sofa eating potato chips. Astria, who was waiting for Cashin to finish the meeting beside me, was quite good at playing the role of a mother. Excuse me, please don't dirty the sofa. Cashin is a bit of a clean freak. This woman was not only the representative of the Cooperative Party B who had just returned from abroad but also very familiar with Cashin. I obediently put away the potato chips and looked at Astria innocently. Sister, you really care about Cashin. So why didn't you marry Cashin? Was it because you didn't like him? How stiff Astria's smile was could be seen from the extent of her makeup caking on her lips. It wasn't until I had drunk half a can of Coke that she finally organized her words to retort. Astria snorted. You're just a little good-for-nothing who gets only a few $100 in subsidies, hasn't graduated yet, and has no job. How long do you think Cashin can like you? It's just a passing fancy. As soon as she finished speaking, the door behind her was pushed open. Astria tucked her hair behind her ear and looked back. Cashin. Before she could finish speaking, my voice overshadowed hers. Cashin. I jumped off the sofa and ran to Cashin pitifully, squeezing out 2 tears. Sister Astria said I'm a good-for-nothing. I peeked at Astria while speaking. She looked at me in disbelief. I could tell that she really wanted to give me an Oscar. Cashin raised his hand and rubbed the back of my head, then looked indifferently at the flustered woman. Miss Astria, you still have the leisure to chat with my wife. Does your company have the confidence to deliver the goods ahead of schedule? Astria slowly shook her head. No, Cashin, Miss Astria, I don't seem to be that familiar with you. Astria was left speechless. I added fuel to the fire in the gentlest tone. It doesn't matter that I don't have a job. My husband earns so much money that I can't spend it all in my next life, Sister Astria. Astria was quick to lecture others. That's his money, not yours. Don't you know how to support yourself at all? I looked puzzled. But if I can spend his money, why should I work from 9 to 5 for others and suffer? Oh, just like you. Astria was so angry that her ears rang. Finally, she picked up her bag and left without saying a word. To be honest, I just said those words on purpose to annoy her. I didn't plan to rely on my husband for the rest of my life. I couldn't waste my postgraduate studies. As soon as Astria left, Cashin picked me up and sat on the swivel chair. I sat on his lap avoiding his kisses. What do you want to do? Cashin rubbed my chin and his gaze shifted downward. I want to kiss you. I cupped his face, gave him a quick peck, and quickly pulled away. Okay. Cashin's Adam's apple bobbed, and he chased after me again. Not enough. I backed away with a smile. It's enough. Cashin, you're not in good health right now. Kissing will only make you feel worse. Wait until you build up your strength and get better. I thought it wasn't enough and continued to add fuel to the fire. Or I can pack you a few servings of medicinal food tomorrow to help you. Cashin slowly stroked my loose hair. Hearing this, the corners of his mouth curved up, and his voice was slow but sent a chill down my spine. Lyra, do you know the consequences of making me drink medicinal food? This man really liked to talk big. Although I thought this in my heart, I still couldn't help but feel a bit intimidated. I didn't argue with Cashin anymore. In the not-too-distant future, when I regretted provoking Cashin on this day, I had already been tortured for hours and was barely alive. Astria must have had good grades when she was a student. It could be seen from her attitude of loving to learn. After I took a nap that day and came out of the lounge inside the office, I saw Astria again. She stared at me warily. I yawned. Sister Astria, you really shouldn't use this foundation anymore. You always have makeup caking every time. Astria immediately took out a small mirror and hurriedly fixed her makeup. Then suddenly she turned her spearhead at me. Little good for nothing, I didn't offend you today, did I? Why are you targeting me? My last bit of sleepiness was completely driven away. I looked at her with a half smile. Old woman, I was just kindly reminding you. You. Cashin had just tidied up and came out of the lounge. Astria furrowed her brow slightly, her tone full of grievance. Cashin, she called me an old woman. I was so shocked by this familiar scene that I couldn't say a word for a long time. Cashin seemed not to have heard and directly turned on the computer. I finally came to my senses. What should we do then? Or you can call the police? As if to echo my words, Cashin pressed 110 on his phone and then turned it to Astria. Miss Astria, feel free to do as you please. Astria had a hot temper and was a bit stupid. She threw the file directly onto Cashin's desk and turned around and left on her high heels. This time, she even left her bag behind. With good intentions and also not wanting her to take the opportunity to come back to find Cashin again, I picked up her bag and chased after her. Miss Astria. Astria stopped for a moment and then walked even faster. She said without looking back. Don't try to catch up and scold me. I thought her way of thinking was really abnormal. So I had to run after her. But before I could catch up, my shoe suddenly slipped. Ah! Astria heard my cry and turned around, reaching out as if she wanted to pull me. But it was a step too late. I fell to the side. My head hit the cabinet of one of the office desks. By sheer coincidence. This collision directly dispersed the blood clot in my brain. A second before my consciousness disappeared, I saw Cashin who rushed over in a hurry. I was jumping through the nodes of my memoirs in my dream. Before my arranged marriage with Cashin, he had met Astria. Although there was no official announcement, their being inseparable already said it all. I thought that when marrying me, Cashin must have been reluctant. But Cashin wasn't like this before. On my 11th birthday, I loudly announced my birthday wish in front of everyone. Lyra hopes that she can marry Brother Cashin when she grows up. Everyone burst into laughter. Only Cashin was tightly pursing his lips, looking a bit pale. The smile on my lips couldn't help but slowly fade away. Taking advantage of when no one was noticing, I walked over and sat down beside him. Is Brother Cashin unhappy because of my wish? I was listlessly kicking the floor with my toes, my tone low. Cashin had a serious look on his little face and earnestly admonished me. Lyra, wishes shouldn't be spoken out. Otherwise, they won't come true. He said that his birthday wish this year was the same as mine. But he had done a good job of making the wish silently. He hoped that I wouldn't make this mistake again in the future. Such a Cashin had suddenly changed. He and Astrea were praised by the elders of the family as a perfect match. I once thought that he would marry Astrea, but for some reason, Astrea suddenly went abroad. Cashin also disappeared for a while. When he reappeared, the parents of both sides arranged the arranged marriage between me and Cashin. However, after marriage, Cashin tacitly allowed me to sleep in a separate room. He was restrained and polite towards me, more like a roommate than a husband. I had always thought that the person he liked was Astrea. 77 After the effect of the anesthetic wore off, I was awakened by the pain. Cashin was sitting beside my hospital bed. Lyra. He pressed the call button. When the doctor came in to examine me, Cashin just stood silently by and watched me. From time to time, I would look at him and then uncomfortably look away. Until it was just the two of us in the ward again. He was standing in the shadows. After a while, he spoke in a cold voice. You've remembered everything, haven't you? I absent-mindedly hummed in response. I was still digesting these two completely different memories in my mind that I couldn't hold on and soon fell asleep again. When I woke up at dawn, Cashin had already left. Astrea, however, came to visit me with big and small bags of tonics. Are you okay, little loser? I was struggling to connect the intellectual woman in my memory with the silly big sister in front of me. She was talking to herself. Wow, you're so unlucky to be stuck with that pervert Cashin. You don't know. He thought I pushed you at that time and had someone detain me in the company. Astrea was so angry that she put her hands on her hips. He was acting like if you didn't wake up, he'd make me pay for it with my life. I pursed my dry lips and asked her. Didn't you like Cashin? Astrea snorted lightly. I used to think he was good-looking and had an awesome temperament, so I liked him a bit. But now I truly believe that he really likes you. Well, I don't want to be a clown anymore. Astrea also said that Cashin liked me. When I had amnesia, Cashin said that he had always liked me from the beginning to the end. I was like a person lost in the fog, unable to find the right way out. Astrea seemed to be trapped in some terrifying memories. Her brows were tightly furrowed. Now whenever I think of Cashin's bloody hands at that time, I get scared. At that time, I thought he was just simply not wanting to be manipulated. Who would have thought it was for you? I suddenly raised my eyes. My gaze shot straight at her. What? The Lyra family was gradually declining. Cashin's father thought that there was no longer a need to have an arranged marriage with the Lyra family. So he chose the Sue family. Astrea, whom he had personally promoted. He had always been a controlling person. He didn't allow Cashin to resist. You can start getting in touch with that girl from the Sue family now. You'll get engaged by the end of the year. Cashin refused neatly. In return, he got a loud slap from his father. He forced Cashin to date Astrea. But Cashin insisted on not marrying Astrea. So Cashin's father gave him two choices. You think you're all grown up now, but if you want to completely break away from me, don't even think about it. Either, you obediently marry Astrea. Or, you implant this into your body, for a lifetime. He was holding a miniature positioning chip. He wanted to control Cashin for a lifetime. Cashin's father was so cold-blooded that he didn't seem like a father. Cashin, you've always been so disobedient. Do you want me to adopt a son and change the heir? Cashin 2 years ago was not yet fully fledged. He chose the latter. His palm was cut open and the locator was implanted. Moreover, to punish him, Cashin's father didn't allow the use of anesthetic. He passed out from the pain. Not long after Cashin was discharged from the hospital, he and I went to get the marriage certificate. Looking back now, I realized that I had overlooked many details. For example, he was a person who usually kept his emotions in check, but on that day, he was unusually smiling all the time. Another example was that he seemed to want to hold my hand. But I unceremoniously avoided him. At that time, I still thought that the person he liked was Astria. So I had been avoiding him all the time. After being discharged from the hospital and returning home. While waiting for Cashin to get off work, I took out the suitcase that I had packed before when I planned to leave. Just as I opened the suitcase and was about to hang the clothes back, Cashin came back. There was a faint smell of alcohol on the man. "You're back." Cashin's eyes fell on my suitcase. He put his hands behind his back and quietly locked the door. The words I wanted to say got stuck in my throat under his increasingly cold gaze. "Where do you want to go?" Cashin stared at me and slowly approached. "Planning to go to your senior?" The man had a faint smile on his face. "Do you really think I don't exist, Lyra?" "No, Cashin." The next second, I was thrown onto the bed by him. Cashin then pressed down on me. "You said that even if you recovered your memory, you wouldn't dislike me." I was the one being restrained. But Cashin was the humble one begging. I looked into his uneasy eyes. "Yes, I did say that." Suddenly, I understood why Cashin had been like he didn't open his mouth and didn't say anything. He thought I liked Orion. Pride often drags people down and makes the path of love winding. Adults aren't that easy to be straightforward, Cashin. This time, I would be the one to take the first step. What Orion said is true. I really did have someone I liked before getting married. The hand on my waist tightened instantly, the knuckles turning white. Cashin stared at me without blinking. I raised both my hands and wrapped them around his neck, smiling. But what a coincidence. What I once said came true. The people we each liked are each other. After saying that, I tilted my head up and kissed him. The man was initially in a daze. Later, he slowly came to his senses and responded. Between our lips and teeth, his voice was hoarse. "Don't lie to me, Lyra." I hugged this little puppy who was shivering from the autumn rain a bit tighter, giving him enough sense of security. After a while, I lay on his ear and whispered. "Cashin, I've recovered my memory. Can your illness be cured now?" Cashin buried his head in my neck, rubbing it casually. "Do you want it to be?" I asked in return. "Don't you want it to be?" "If you don't want it, you're not a man." Cashin chuckled. His hand started to fidgetily rub the hem of my clothes. The other hand reached for the box on the bedside table. Astria described Cashin as a pervert. And at this moment, I think that Cashin, who has drunk alcohol, is a big pervert. He was trying new things even on our first experience. It made me feel like I had just learned to walk and was being forced to run a track and field race. "Cashin, it won't work." Cashin tightly clasped my hands, interlocking our fingers. "It will work, Lyra." He kissed the back of my neck. "Have you ever thought about the floor-to-ceiling windows?" I was already exhausted, but when I heard his shocking words, I was immediately wide awake. "No. But I have." As he said that, the scene shifted to in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. His gentle voice sounded especially perverted at this moment. "It's exciting, isn't it? It's like a live broadcast." I closed my eyes, thinking that it would be nice to just die. I don't know how long it took, but finally, I was let go. This time, I didn't need Cashin to do anything. I wrapped myself tightly in the quilt. I looked at his hand on the quilt and still reached out to hold it, rubbing the scar on it. "Did it hurt a lot at that time?" Cashin only paused for a few seconds before guessing that Astria had told me everything. He kissed my fingertips, his voice light. "It was taken out in the first year. At that time, thinking that I could marry you, I endured it." Cashin was a lovesick fool. I snuggled into his arms, not letting him see my slightly red eyes. Cashin stroked my back and told me about the past. After his father forced him to implant the chip, he started to accelerate the process of undermining his father's power. He gradually replaced his father's confidants in the company. He carried out the replacement bit by bit. By the time his father realized what was going on, Cashin was already the largest shareholder. It took 13 years for Cashin to finally break free from his father's control. Astria was really scared by Cashin. After handing over her work to other people in the company, she still chose to go back to the overseas branch. Before leaving, she avoided Cashin and came to see me once. She was hesitant for a long time before speaking. Well? Do you have any recommendations for a foundation that doesn't cake? I snorted lightly. I'll send you the link. Astria opened her phone. Come on, I'll skin you. Then I saw with my own eyes that she noted me as little loser. Great, smiley face. I have the virtue of reciprocating courtesy. Soon, I also noted her as old woman right in front of her. She accepted my recommendation. Just as she was about to express her dissatisfaction with my note, Cashin's footsteps were getting closer. Astria's hair stood on end. No, I have to go. Cashin is the kind of person. I feel like he has some rather strong tastes. Good luck to you. After saying that, she hurriedly left, afraid of running into her former crush. I propped my cheek on my hand and looked at the man in a neat suit. Did Astria just come? I nodded and continued to stare at him. So pleasing to the eye. I was enjoying the view when the meal ordered by the secretary for me and Cashin arrived. After she put down the lunchboxes, she gave me a meaningful look. At that time, I was completely confused. Until after we finished eating and Cashin was doing a summary in the office. I planned to go out for a walk. The secretary mysteriously stopped me. Madam, has the boss finished eating? I was quite dissatisfied with this title that made me sound 10 years older, but I still focused on the key point. Yes, he has. The secretary let out a sigh of relief. Last time when I was delivering documents to the boss, I accidentally overheard your conversation. Since both you and the boss are people who care about face, I had to do this. Isn't it just to nourish your body? I specially ordered a few highly nourishing dishes for the boss. Madam, don't be polite. If your life is harmonious and the boss is happy, he will probably return the year-end bonus that was deducted last month. Everyone wins. The second silly big sister I met after Astria. By the time I realized what was going on, it was already too late. Cashin just got off work. Driving all the way home, I sneaked glances at him several times. Finding that he looked as usual, I couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Maybe the effect of tonic food wasn't that great, but the closer we got to home, the more I felt that something was wrong. Cashin? Are you okay? The air inside the car seemed to heat up. I looked at the man whose breathing had become a bit heavier and asked tentatively. The next second, he made a sharp turn of the steering wheel and drove into the parking lot. The sense of danger made me instinctively want to escape. But Cashin locked the car immediately. I tried my best to ignore his burning gaze and pretended to be calm. In this situation, I think you can just take a cold bath like in the TV series. Cashin ignored my nonsense. He directly adjusted the seat, leaving a large enough space, then he raised his eyes, his voice low and hoarse. Come here. I grasped the seat belt tightly and shook my head firmly. I'll die. With Cashin looking like this, I felt that I would really be half dead when I got out of the car. The man pinched the space between his eyebrows slightly, clearly on the verge of losing his self-control. Either. I'll come over. Having no way out, I had no choice but to climb over shakily and straddle Cashin's legs. He raised his head and kissed me gently, soothing me softly. Don't be afraid, Lyra. Don't be afraid, my ass. An hour later, I started crying and pushing Cashin away. 2 hours later, I could only lean weakly on his shoulder. 3 hours later, I was barely alive. After being carried upstairs to the bedroom by Cashin, I almost fell asleep as soon as my head touched the pillow. Suddenly, my cell phone on the bedside table rang. I frowned, reached for it and turned on the screen. Secretary, Madam, if possible, could you please mention my year-end bonus to the boss for me? After all, I'm too embarrassed to bring it up. At this moment, my anger reached its peak. The strength with which I pressed my finger on the screen was almost enough to break the phone. Year-end bonus? You can forget about getting any bonus in the future. My movements were a bit large and caught Cashin's attention. Chatting so vigorously. I see you're not that sleepy yet. I threw the phone away with a snap and got into the quilt. I'm sleepy. I'll fall asleep right away. That night, I dreamed of myself on my 11th birthday again. I watched my younger self put her hands together and loudly say that she wanted to marry Cashin. Then I told her seriously. Your wish has come true. The end.